Hi guys, much like me, today's video is going to be simple. I have the little ZV-E10 and I also have the little Fuji X-S10. I have a Sigma 16mm f1.4 and a Sigma 16mm f1.4. Also, I have two Viltrox 13mm for each of the cameras. So let's go out vlogging and see who does what. So big shout out to the folks over at B&H Photo for lending me the Fuji X-S10 with the Sigma 16mm f1.4. I already have the little ZV-E10 and the 16mm from Sigma here in the studio, and I also have 13mm from Viltrox for each of the two cameras. Thanks to the guys over at B&H Photo, you guys rock. So first I'll use aperture priority auto settings with auto white balance and auto ISO so you can see how the cameras do against each other when you just let them do the work. And I'll start with the 16mm, then I'll move to the 13mm from Viltrox, and then at the end I will show you how I think each of the cameras performs at their best and how I would color grade that footage. So let's go do that now. Oh wait, so if you're wondering how I did it, I put the two cameras on these ball heads on this little tripod and I walked around easy as pie. Wasn't even heavy, a little bit for a guy like me. Okay, so I'm on the 16mm from Sigma on the ZV-E10, 16mm from Sigma on the X-S10, and as you can see, the ZV-E10 crops way in there when it wants to do some stabilization, and this is just the in-body image stabilization on the Fuji. So let's go for a little walk. I'll extend my arm out just a little bit using my Herculean strength. I have this two cameras with these two lenses on a tripod. Luckily I'm a marvel of human genetics, so this is nothing for me. Casey Neistat, he's got nothing on me. So how's the stabilization look? I noticed that the Fuji is a bit wobbly in the corners, especially on the much wider lenses. Like this one's 16, it's not too bad, but you will see in the next test, the Viltrox 13, it wobbles quite a bit. Now, let's use the digital stabilization to see if that helps the Fuji out at all when I'm walking. Had to switch arms there. Now, this is the digital stabilization on the Fuji to go along with the digital stabilization, which is all the ZV-E10 has to offer. And as you can see, the Fuji is still a nice bit wider. Now, do you find it more stable? Are the corners wobbling? Oh, and I should say, I'm just using aperture priority for both of these guys. I find, especially the Fuji, if you don't use aperture priority, you're going to see those exposure jumps when the camera is changing settings for you. So if you're on shutter priority, that is a no-go. And even in auto mode, you see the exposure jumps a fair bit. On the Sony, it can happen, but it doesn't really happen with this lens. The Viltrox lens, it happens a little bit. So I would say if you're not using fully manual settings on the Fuji, definitely go with aperture priority, and really same thing for the ZV-E10. It's just not quite as pronounced. So, oh, and there's one more trick the ZV-E10 has up its sleeve. Let's look at that. So now I'm recording the gyroscopic data for the Sony camera, and I'm running it through Catalyst Browse, and you see gimbal-like footage, even though I don't have a gimbal. Might as well stick a gimbal up on top of this rig. It's getting so heavy. And right here we have just the Fuji with its in-body image stabilization and its digital crop. And what do you think? I mean, I haven't seen this yet because I have to do it in post, but I know the Sony comes out very, very smoothly. So now we're on the Viltrox here so that you can see that corner wobble. Of course, I'm running the latest firmware update of both the lens and the camera, but the wobble is real when you're going to wide angle lenses like this. As you saw, it was much better on the Sigma, but when you have a lens as wide as a 13mm, this is what you're gonna get. Fuji over there. No, the Sony over there is still on Catalyst Browse because that is how I use my Sony. So let's switch this over to the digital stabilization and see if that helps. So now we have the digital stabilization on with the Viltrox 13mm. How does that look? Is it better? Is it the same? What do you think? Is it wobbling? Am I wobbling? Can I wobble in the corner? Now am I wobbling? Am I wobbling? Now I have both cameras in shutter priority to show that stepping thing I was talking about. You don't want to leave the Fuji, especially in shutter priority on this Viltrox lens or any lens, really, because you will get a lot of these flashes that you're seeing right now. Now the Sony does, I think it does do it, but it's much more subtle. So with the Fuji, I would say only aperture priority if you want to use automatic settings. I wouldn't use the full auto settings, or certainly not the shutter priority ever. The full auto settings does a little bit of this with the Fuji, but nothing like this shutter priority. So stay away from the shutter priority on the Fuji for sure. So now this is how I would actually use the Fujifilm X-S10 in the vlogging situation, where you're walking and talking about your dumb ideas. That is what this is. I would use the Sigma 16mm f1.4 to minimize the wobbly corners, and I use my Ulanzi selfie stick here. I extend it out a little bit further. I'm using the IBIS in the camera and the digital stabilization as well. I'm also shooting here on f-log. Normally I don't shoot a log profile on an 8-bit camera, but this scene doesn't have a ton of dynamic range, so it should be fine when I apply my Paul Leeming corrective LUT. I've also manually white balanced to get the best looking image I can out of the camera. And because I'm not holding two cameras at once on the selfie stick, I am able to stabilize it much better. So to me, this is the best vlogging situation you could probably have right now, as opposed to the 13mm, something wider like that Viltrox lens. Now this is how I would often use the little ZV-E10. I am using HLG3 picture profile, Paul Leeming LUT once again. I'm using the Ulanzi stick, which is extended the same as the Fuji, but I'm using the 13mm from Viltrox, so that when I use active stabilization like I'm using right now, the 40% crop still gives me a decent field of view. Now you can actually get the Sony 11mm f1.8 or the Tamron 11-20 or the Sony 10-20 and get an even wider field of view. Those are such great lenses for vlogging, all of them, especially the 11mm, because it's so small and light. I really like the image that I'm getting out of the camera right now. I am white balancing manually as well, all manual exposure, making sure everything's right. I have the zebras right on my face here, Safari running wild, to make sure that all my exposure is correct. So this is how I would recommend you use the Sony camera if you want to have that fast turnaround and you don't want to go through the extra step of catalyst browse. Then I would do this: wide lens, use the active stabilization, you're golden. And this is that same shot using catalyst browse. This is an extra step, but I don't mind doing it. You know, the whole thing takes time, out shooting, editing, putting it together. So I'm not going to skimp on the possibility of getting super smooth footage with a wider field of view. I think is worth it. Now, to me, it takes about 3 minutes to edit 1 minute of footage on my computer. So your results may vary. And I understand if people don't want to do this step. I just personally love that the gyroscopic data is recorded and that I can do this type of thing. Oh, yeah. So what are the takeaways here? Well, I think the takeaways are either camera can be used as a great vlogging camera, but you do have to know how to use them. The Fuji, you definitely don't want to put in shutter priority or even straight up auto mode, or you're going to see some of those exposure stepping things. So use manual settings or use aperture priority. And also with the Fuji, I don't think you want to go too wide. The 16mm I think is as wide as you should probably go. The 13mm, the corners are too wobbly. It is too distracting. So I would just use the 16mm and hold it out a little bit further. And because the Fuji doesn't do much of a crop in its E-stabilization and its IBIS does okay anyway with the 16mm, then that is how I would use the Fuji. Now, the Sony, on the other hand, what I would do is get one of the wider lenses like the 11mm or the Viltrox 13, but the 11mm from Sony is so much lighter than the Viltrox, and then you can use the active stabilization. However, as you know, I love the catalyst browse, so you could use the 11, the 13, the 15, the 16, whatever you want to use, and use catalyst browse for the Sony. So when it comes to autofocus, the Fuji has been very good. When I'm in the studio, it hasn't lost me. I always use autofocus with this guy, and it's been pretty stellar, except on that test where I was doing the f-log, so it seemed to struggle a little bit to keep focus in f-log. It wasn't drifting in and out, it just missed focus a tiny bit. And now the Sony, on the other hand, the little ZV-E10, the focus is infallible. It is just always perfect, always on point. So if you really want critical autofocus, the Sony is going to be the way to go. But I will say that the Fuji has impressed me with its autofocus. It is just not quite Sony level autofocus. So I'm going to do some more videos with these guys, so be sure to subscribe if you want to see that, if you're not a subscriber already. And thanks for watching this one. I appreciate it. We'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.